You know I want you. It's not a secret I try to hide. You know you want me, so don't keep saying our hands are tied. You claim it's not in the cards, and fate is pulling you miles away and out of reach from me. But you're here in my heart, so who can stop me if I decide that you're my destiny? What if we rewrite the stars? Say you were made to be mine. Nothing could keep us apart.
Actually, we have finished one of the earlier poem, the Ballad of Reading Jail and the Goblin Market by others. So it's another important poem, The Blessed Damosel, written by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So Gabriel Rossetti is actually very much associated with the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, which we have already discussed, which is for art's sake, reacting against the mechanistic view of art. Now, moving to this poem was actually an inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is a depiction of a lover grieving on earth over the death of his loved one. So, this poem actually, The Blessed Damosel. Damosel is actually an old term, an archaic word meaning damsel, a young unmarried woman. Okay. So, the blessed meaning that she is no more, she is dead, and she is right up there in heaven. So, of course, she is a pious woman and is blessed too. So, the title signifies so, the blessed damosel. This poem thus is an inspiration of an earlier work written by Poe. Okay, so this is a background information for the poem. Next slide, please. Okay, fine. Now we shall move in detail to the poem. So the poem is actually a dramatic lyric poem. It's of 144 lines in 24 6-line stanzas, that is sestet. So there is a big poem actually, but it's very beautiful poem with love theme. But though it is a love poem, since we know that it is being cultivated in a Victorian era, a Victorian atmosphere, of course there will be negativity or pessimism associated with it. So, though it's a romantic poem, a love poem, it has a depressing undertone in it, as it's about unfulfilled love. It's eternal love, it's undying love, but it's not fulfilled or it's not joined. Okay. Now, the first version was completed in 1847 and published in 1850 in the journal called The Germ. It's quite no, it's quite important to note because actually Dante Gabriel Rossetti was very much criticized for his sensuous imagery and erotic imagery and all, and his the whole pre-Raphaelite brotherhood was actually criticized as the fleshy school of poetry by one of critics like Robert Buchanan. And this poem is actually not a true example of his sensuous imagery content, but to it is very much important to note that with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, most of the poems contain such themes associated with it. Okay. Now, this we have already discussed. The Rossetti conceived the idea for the poem after reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. That poem actually is about a man who mourns the death of his beloved Leonard, and after reviewing Dante's Divine Comedy. So, earlier when we discussed Blake's The Lamb, I have already mentioned that he was also a poet and painter. Here in the biographical details of Gabriel Rossetti, I have mentioned that he is a poet and a painter. There too we have mentioned the illuminated printing where a poem accompanies with a painting. Here in Gabriel's poetry too, the poem is associated with a painting which is very beautiful, very detailedly woven and a clear depiction of the poem itself. Okay, so in such poetry, the poet himself present his interpretation of the poem. So, the theme of the poem is actually the undying love, eternal love, waiting for love. Okay, so can you change the slide, please? This is the poem actually. It's of this much 144 lines are there. So, can you please show the poem, please? Poem, please. I mean the whole poem, the previous slide before the painting. Yeah, please zoom in the poem. You can see that in some of the stanzas it's written ordinarily, but in some stanza there is a parenthesis, a bracket is there. So actually in the poem there are two speakers. The one speaker is actually the blessed damsel or the damsel, the young lady who is right up there in the heaven. It's presented in third person narrative, in a omniscient narrative view, but in parenthesis it's in a first person point of view, first person speaker, where the earthly lover is mourning over his beloved. Okay, so I just want to mention that. So can you change the slide, please? So this is actually the painting. So when the previous slide, please. Hello. Yeah, fine. So if you notice this painting, you can clearly understand that the poem which suggests about the three lilies, it's clearly depicted in the painting. There are three lilies in that woman's hand, and there is below that there is the lover who is mourning over her absence. Okay. Now the next slide, please. The next one. Okay. Now this is the first stanza. The blessed Damosel leaned out from the gold bar of heaven. Her eyes were deeper than the depth of waters stilled at even. She had 3 lilies in her hand, and the stars in her hair were 7. Okay, this is the first stanza, and I have mentioned that in the portrayal also there are 3 lilies in her hand and there are stars in her hair, and this is actually the fantasy type portrayal where both the lovers there in heaven and in earth fantasizes, dreams about their joining, their absence, their distance, everything. Okay. Here, Damosel is actually, as I have mentioned, it's an archaic word. Heaven is pictured as a castle high above and beyond the world. Gold bar is such an imagery describing the golden barrier which surrounds heaven, or such a frame-like imagery. Here, one thing we have to understand is that the painting Rossetti did also contain a golden frame. So it also suggests, it is also very much suggestive of his poem. So the third and fourth lines describe the quiet depth of her eyes and stillness of the water in the evening, that her eyes are even deeper than the water. 3 lilies alludes to the Trinity and 7 stars. The whole poem, though it may appear as a love poem and on the surface level, it has much Christian imagery, biblical allusions to it. There is much reference to the Holy Trinity, Holy Spirit, and about Mary. When there is a mentioning of white rose, which symbolizes Mary, and there are many instances where biblical allusions are given. Okay. So 7 stars are also symbolize the Pleiades, the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione. It's about Greek mythology. So the poem contains much symbolism and imagery within it. Okay. Now next slide, please. It was the rampart of God's house that she was standing on, by God built over the sheer depth, the which is space begun, so high that looking downward thence she scarce could see the sun. Here, the poet actually presents his own view of heaven. He actually recreates a heaven in his own vision. He gives many much physical details to the heaven he sees in a fantasy world, a golden bar, a rampart, and many things. The main portrayer here is the distance between the lovers. It is clearly projected in the poem. Actually, if we detailedly analyze the poem, the main settings of the poem are the earth, the heaven, and the fantasy land. The fantasy land presents the major theme. The fantasy, around this fantasy, the whole poem revolves. Okay. So the rampart of God's house is actually the physical vision of heaven's walls. Sheer depth, the, the which is space begun, shows the distance between the earth and heaven, and downward thence from there to beneath. So this stanza depicts the distance between the earth and heaven. It also fathoms the pain of the separated young lovers and emphasizes the vastness of the gulf separating them. The distance between them is so enormous that she can hardly see the sun, and she is not even able to see the earth from that height. So the blessed damsel is actually in such a height, such a distant area where they cannot even think of any union. So the poem presents a depressing tone of love. Okay. Now next slide, please. Now, this is one of the stanza which presents the speaker, the first person speaker, which is the earthly lover. Okay, the previous two stanzas were of the blessed damsel. So, actually, in most of the lines here, coming to the literary devices of the poem, there are many devices like alliteration is there is consonance, and there is internal rhyme and end rhyme. So a repetition of many literary devices is very much evident in the poem. Actually, this is very much suggestive of the theme of the poem too. These two lovers, they are eternally, infinitely waiting for their union. Day by day, the same repetition of their waiting is accumulated in each stanza. So the repetition of the literary devices in a way deeply connects to the theme of the poem, the waiting, the distance, their infinity of love. Okay. Now, the stanza. To one it is 10 years of years, yet now and in this place, surely she leaned o'er me, her hair fell all about my face. Nothing, the autumn fall of leaves, the whole year sets apace. Here, the earthly lover mourns over her loss. He feels as if she has separated over 10 years. Okay, so it intensifies the pain, the agony of the lover. These lines are a combination of fantasy, sensuality, and longing in the midst of decay, along with the emphasis on her and the adored lady of the poem. Lover, for her lover, it is as if she has been gone 10 years of years. While the young man thinks he feels her hair fall over him, he discovers only the fall of autumn leaves. So he's back to reality. The whole poem revolves around the fantasy land, and thus the poem is that much the beautification or the aestheticism. See, Gabriel Rossetti was also a forerunner of aestheticism, so the beautification of lines is quite apt. And Lady's hair supports the romantic image of the pre-Raphaelite poetry. He was also inspiring Blake, Keats. Okay, so he has that romantic vein in his poetry. Now, can you change the slide, please? Okay. Now, throughout the poem, the earth-bound lover voice is found through the sections encompassed in parentheses. Okay, the asides begin in past tense and by the end of the poem are in present tense. There is a division between parts which are calm, which is heaven, and parts which are disturbed, which is earth. The division is shown through the use of regular verse, irregular stanzas. Now, coming to the meter of the poem does not show a consistent same meter. It is alternating between iambic trimeter and iambic tetrameter. Okay, so it is alternating, as I have mentioned about the alliteration, consonants, internal and end rhyme repeating. This trimeter and tetrameter is also repeating, suggestive of the theme. Okay, now in most of the poems in literature, we have seen heaven as an embodiment of peace, eternal love, eternal joy. Okay, and earth as an area of confusion, suffering, and what to say, pain, agony. Okay, but here in this poem, though, the blessed damsel is there, right up there in the heaven. She is very much fed up of waiting. She has seen many lovers there. If you notice in the painting, at the back of the damsel, you see many combination of lovers. So it adds to the depressing tune of the poem. She is actually depressed by many spirits who have their partners, but her own lover is right in the, is there in earth. And one more thing to add here is that here in the earth and in heaven, they are not joined. So the undying love is not fulfilled yet. So they long to join even in a fantasy land. Here the damsel actually expected time when her lover on earth will die and will come to heaven in white clothes, where he and she will just sit under the mystic tree of the heaven. I have mentioned that the poem is filled with Christian imagery and allusions. The mystic tree actually refers to the holy tree, and there will be a dove which is suggestive of the Holy Spirit, and they will share their love in the heaven. And of course, Jesus and Mary will admit their love, will bless them. So she expects and she fantasizes about their union in such a way. Though in some lines the earthly lover comes back to his reality, where he finds that he is in earth, he is just seeing his dream, he just sees that her hair just moves over his face, and next time he realizes he's been on earth. So the poem revolves in such a theme. Okay, now can you change the slide, please? So the main thesis, this main idea revolving around the poem is the theme of undying love, shown to be one of the transcendental value as the distance between heaven and earth, which seems to wide throughout the poem, becomes smaller by the last stanza. Throughout the poem, the theme of distance is very much strong. The distance the lovers facing, and also here Gabriel Rossetti clearly portrays a separation of the real world and the afterlife. Okay, the mortal world and the eternal life. And his image of a heaven, his image of how a god should be, his image how the life there should be, is clearly projected in this poem. So the poem is actually filled with symbolism, biblical allusion, grief over the lost lover in the earth, and a world of fantasy, the distance, and the theme of waiting, which is very much constant, and the distance and this waiting is very much connected. Okay, so next slide, please. So the main idea of the poem is about a woman looking down upon her lover from heaven. So the tune of the poem is actually romantic, yet it is very much depressing. So this is very much connecting to the Victorian era. Wants to be with him for eternity but knows that it can never happen. So the whole poem is in a fantasy world, uses similes, metaphors, flowers, and biblical allusions to convey her eternal love for this man. Here, flowers. Flowers is another symbol used in the poem. In the beginning stanza, we have mentioned about three lilies. Three lilies is actually a symbol for the Holy Trinity. And in the later stanza, there is a mentioning of a white rose, which is suggestive of Mary, and also all these flowers indirectly connects to the pious, the purity, innocence of this blessed damsel. See, the thing, a biographical element which we should consider here is that actually Gabriel Rossetti wrote this poem at his age of 18. So that much the naivety, the freshness, all that is associated with a younger age perception of love is clearly projected in this poem. When we come to later ages, we will clearly know about the harsh face of love and all. But in this poem, writing from a very young age, he has projected that much freshness, beautification of love in all its spheres. Okay. Now, can you change the slide, please? So, as I have mentioned, the poem is clearly containing symbolism, imagery, allegory, which is Christian allusions actually. Many revelations of Jesus Christ is connected to many lines. Okay, and since the whole poem, the main one of the main settings of the poem is actually heaven, it is obvious that many Christian imagery will be there in the poem. And flowers, as I have mentioned now, and also the intensity of distance is mentioned in the previous stanza, which I have explained. The damsel, the blessed damsel, right up there in the heaven, she can't even see the sun, which is very much far from the earth. So it is that much, they are that much separated in earth and in heaven. Okay, so can you change the slide, please? So now moving on to the previous year questions. Most of the questions will be based on the overall poem. Write a critical appreciation of the blessed damsel, or write a short note on the blessed damsel. One another question was that, based on your understanding of the blessed damsel, explain how Rossetti is concerned with the connection between this physical world and the world of the afterlife. Actually, the whole poem revolves around the earth and the heaven, the physical life and the afterlife. He projects physical life and afterlife as in a depressing mood, thus in the mood of their theme of love, because they haven't united yet. Here, heaven is not considered as an eternal thing to be attained. Here, love is given the supreme theme. Okay. Now, one RTC which has came is, when round his head the aureole clings, and he is clothed in white, I will take his hand and go with him to the deep wells of light. As unto a stream, we will step down and bathe there in God's sight. This is the expectation, the fantasy of the blessed damsel actually. She expects a time when her lover on earth will come and join her in heaven, clothed in white, which is actually when he's dying. And there they will spend their time together. They will immerse in their loving actually. Okay, so this is all about the poem. So please do remember that I have not mentioned about anything about pre-Raphaelite brotherhood and aestheticism. Please do connect with Dandre Gabriel Rossetti, the Victorian age, aestheticism, and also the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. It has been